He ruled over half the world, but every night he was afraid of being alone. His bedroom was no longer a place of rest but became a place of torment. The muffled sobs of the young queen, the stifled groans of the king himself, and that same sound behind the velvet curtains remained forever in the memory of the courtiers. No one dared to intervene, and no one left the chambers. Not even she, his own wife. Everything that was hidden behind the closed doors turned into a forbidden story, never mentioned in school lessons or carved into bronze monuments. There was only him, Philip V of Spain, a man whose obsession made him a prisoner of his own desires and turned his passion into a cage. But to understand how one of Europe's greatest monarchs became a shadow of himself, one must return to his childhood, to the moment when the first crack appeared in his mind. Philip was known as the Silent Bourbon. He was born into the French royal family in 1683, but even as a child, he seemed strange to that glittering world. While other children played in the gardens of Versailles, he preferred to stay silent, staring into emptiness for hours. His stillness was so complete that servants sometimes checked whether he was still breathing. His teachers complained that he showed no interest or emotion, did not respond to praise, and did not react to punishment. He seemed to live somewhere outside reality, inside his own world. The only person he was close to was his mother, Marie Anne of Bavaria. Gentle and caring, she became more than a mother to him. She was a shield from the outside world. Little Philip held onto her constantly, finding in her presence the peace no one else could give him. But when his mother suddenly died from illness, the boy seemed to vanish together with her. There were no tears, no crying. He simply withdrew into silence. Servants said that after her death, the child stopped speaking and sat quietly for days. Some historians believe that this was when the first signs of mental illness appeared. Others think it was a trauma that time never healed. Either way, this emptiness followed him throughout his life. Unlike other heirs raised in luxury, Philip appeared detached, cold, and distant. But fate decided differently. When his older relatives suddenly died, it was this quiet boy who found himself at the center of Europe's ambitions. At 17, he ascended the Spanish throne. A teenager unprepared for such responsibility suddenly became ruler of a vast empire where people spoke a language he did not understand and where every step he made was watched closely. During his coronation, he seemed a stranger still unsmiling, as if he could not believe he was at the center of the ceremony. He had neither experience in government nor in war. Spain received him with suspicion, seeing him as a foreigner entrusted with their crown. And in this cold and unfamiliar environment, the young king did what he had always done as a child. He clung to someone close. In 1701, Philip married Maria Louisa of Savoy. She was 13 and he was 17. For the dynasty, it was a usual political alliance, but for him, she became salvation. He was drawn to her with the same strength with which he had once held onto his mother. At first, it seemed harmless. He accompanied her everywhere, listened to her every word, and looked at her with attention given to no one else. His eyes came alive when she was near. For the courtiers, it even seemed touching. The king was finally showing emotion. But what began as tenderness soon became dependence. In her presence, he found peace, but without her, panic overtook him. It was not love in the ordinary sense, it was dependence. He could not eat unless she was nearby, could not sleep unless she was beside him. Even during state meetings, he demanded that she sit next to him. Otherwise, he could not speak to his advisors. Gradually, Maria Luisa realized that her husband did not need a wife, but a shadow, always near. Thus ended his development, not as the King of Spain, but as a man who could no longer live without the presence of another. Everything that had started in his childhood now blossomed in his marriage. And behind the royal gates, a story began that would become a curse for the country and, for his wife, a slow torment. For the young wife, all this became a heavy burden. She was only 13 when she found herself in a foreign land, surrounded by a strange language and unfamiliar faces. Instead of adapting to court life, she became chained to her husband. Her freedom disappeared with each passing day. At first, she thought it was her duty to support the young monarch and stay by his side. But soon the royal court began to whisper that Spain no longer had a ruler, only a man unable to act without his wife. The advisors tried to hide Philip's growing eccentricities. Some said he was too young and lacked experience, while others believed his passion was simply a sign of genuine love. But the nights revealed his secret. Around 2:30 a.m., groans, screams, and sobs began to echo through the palace corridors. The guards on duty exchanged pale looks. Behind the heavy curtains, one could hear not the sounds of sickness or marital affection, but something far more troubling, the cries of despair and prayers of a young woman, mixed with the childish, hysterical screams of the king, turned Maria Luisa into a prisoner, not only in body but also in spirit. Her life no longer belonged to her. She could not walk in the garden, could not speak freely with the ladies at court, and could not even sleep in peace. Any attempt to leave, even for a few moments, brought about a storm. Philip would begin to scream as if his very life were being taken away. Over time, her own body began to show exhaustion. She lost weight, her eyes became dull, and her voice turned weak and strained, as if every word required strength. Yet the entire burden of Spain's rule gradually fell on her shoulders. Since the king refused to leave his chambers, it was she who gave orders to ministers, signed documents, and received ambassadors. She was called the Invisible Queen. Almost no one saw her face, but her words decided the fate of the kingdom. It was a strange form of shared power. The state lived by the commands of a young woman, written with a trembling hand from the edge of her bed, while her husband held her wrist so she would not escape. The court became a shadow, ruled by the whims of one obsessed man and one woman deprived of her freedom. But such a situation could not last forever. At 25, barely at the beginning of her life, Maria Luisa was so exhausted that any illness could be fatal. A brief sickness, made worse by years of draining captivity, took away her remaining strength. Spain did not yet know that her death would not end the tragedy. It would only begin it. For Philip, the loss of his wife was like a lightning strike. He collapsed beside her body and did not get up for a long time. For weeks, he refused to speak, would not eat, and did not leave his room. It seemed as if his will to live had died with her. But this was not silent mourning. It was the start of a descent into madness that would drag the entire court with him. After Maria Luisa's death, the courtiers saw the king at his weakest. Philip barely moved from the floor beside her body. He did not speak, did not eat, did not wash. For 3 weeks, the kingdom had no ruler. Ministers were lost and Spain stood still. When courtiers dared to suggest that he marry again for the sake of the dynasty, the king's reaction horrified everyone. He laughed wildly and said, "She hasn't gone, she's hiding." To him, Maria Luisa had not disappeared. She had only gone somewhere unseen, and he was convinced she could return. Then he ordered that a woman be found who resembled his late wife as closely as possible. The same age, height, eye color, and dark hair. And such a woman was found, Elizabeth Farnese of Parma. At the end of 1714, Philip married her, but the court immediately understood. This was not a new queen, but a replacement for the former one. The Farneses forced her to wear Maria Luisa's gowns, use her perfume, and repeat her usual phrases. Servants wrote that she was not a wife, but a reflection. At first, Elizabeth played the part obediently, but over time the king's demands became increasingly severe. She was not allowed to go out without permission, could not cry, and could not be left alone. She was required to spend all her time with him, day and night. Meanwhile, Philip's own oddities grew worse. He refused to wear royal clothing, shaved his head, dressed in rough monastic robes, and let his nails grow. Sometimes he would whisper prayers by the fire through the night, then start laughing or weeping for no clear reason. The court realized that Spain was no longer ruled by a man, but by sickness. Yet an even darker fate awaited them, a monarch who refused to govern, yet also refused to give up power. By the middle of 1720, Philip was no longer able to carry out his duties. He did not appear before his ministers, refused to sign documents, and would not decide matters of state without his wife at his side. If Elizabeth left the room, he would fall silent and sit motionless. In 1724, under pressure from the court and European allies, Philip agreed to surrender the crown. The throne passed to his eldest son, Louis. He was only 17, but many saw in him a hope for the nation's renewal. For the first time in many years, the court felt relief. Spain gained a young, energetic ruler, and the country was no longer hostage to nightly hysterics. But that hope did not last long. 7 months later, Louis contracted smallpox. The illness advanced quickly, and in August 1724, the young king died. Philip's reaction shocked his courtiers. Instead of grief, he said, "God has returned the crown to the one who should wear it." Then he resumed the throne as if nothing had occurred. But it was no longer the same monarch who returned. It was a man completely broken and dangerous. Now Spain had a sovereign who feared mirrors, curtains, and sunlight, and heard voices from fireplaces. Although he officially ruled the country, in truth, more and more decisions went through Elizabeth Farnese. After regaining the throne in 1724, Philip V appeared even more withdrawn. He avoided public gatherings, lost focus, and spent long hours in dark rooms. Servants noticed he feared mirrors, believing they could trap souls. Loud noises drove him into fits, and in the silence he claimed to hear voices and whispers of invisible spirits. His second wife, Elizabeth Farnese, effectively acted as his deputy at court. All documents, diplomatic talks, and decisions passed through her. She presented herself as a strong regent but stayed in the background, aware that too much interference would anger the nobility. Philip, meanwhile, sank deeper into ritual. He wore coarse linen garments, refused shoes, and rarely appeared in daylight. Sometimes he prayed for hours or repeated a single word again and again, before suddenly falling into hysterics. Foreign ambassadors realized that Spain was now ruled by an unseen power. French and Austrian envoys described the country in reports as a state with a king in name only. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Farnese used his weakness to expand her own control. Through court alliances and diplomatic marriages, she advanced her children's positions, securing them influence in Europe. But the court increasingly understood behind the royal doors lived more than a frail ruler. There existed a man detached from reality. He had completely abandoned royal dress. Instead of velvet and gold, he wore coarse, loose monk's robes, convinced that such fabric protected him from sin. He stopped cutting his hair and nails, stayed away from light, and sometimes remained in bed for weeks, believing that the darkness behind the curtains protected his soul. At night, servants heard shouting, sobbing, and endless prayers. During the day, he almost never spoke, sometimes repeating the same sentence for hours. He would suddenly run toward the wall and scratch the stone, screaming at invisible enemies. Then he would fall into complete stillness, lying motionless like a statue. Elizabeth Farnese held all authority in her hands. She managed access to her husband, checked the ambassadors, and dictated decisions to the ministers. At court, people whispered that Spain was ruled not by the monarch but by his wife, through the pillows and candles in the bedroom. For the people, the king had already become a legendary figure. Some said he was a saint who spent his life in prayer. Others said he was possessed and brought misfortune to the nation. In the letters of ambassadors, Spain was openly described as a country without a face. But while Europe watched from outside, inside the palace, Elizabeth's life was becoming a constant nightmare. She was no longer a wife. She had become the nurse and guardian of a man who was no longer himself. By the middle of the 1730s, the court had no illusions left. Philip V was a king only in title. In truth, he had become a prisoner of his own fears and habits, and his whole life was reduced to an endless cycle of rituals and fits. He finally stopped appearing in public. Even religious ceremonies, sacred to a Catholic monarch, now occurred without him. He no longer attended Mass, received delegations, or met ambassadors. Everything that happened in Spain went through his wife, Elizabeth Farnese. His appearance also turned into part of a terrible legend. Instead of royal robes, he wore linen cassocks like a monk living in solitude. He believed that only they could protect him from temptation. His hair grew into long, tangled strands, his nails like claws. The chambers smelled of dampness, oil, and a body that had not felt water or air for many weeks. His fears were particularly disturbing. He feared mirrors and ordered them all to be removed from the palace, believing that reflections stole souls. He feared sunlight and hid behind heavy curtains, convinced that the rays could destroy him. The sound of bells made him tremble. Even part of the fireplace caused attacks. He thought demons spoke to him through the flames. All this made the palace resemble a closed monastery. Ambassadors arriving from France, Austria, or England sent reports calling Spain a country without a ruler. They wrote that a woman governed the country, while the king himself had become a living ghost. But Elizabeth Farnese stayed nearby. She performed her role until the end, wife, nurse, and shadow of the late Maria Luisa. For her, this meant constant life in darkness, in the smell of decay and fear, in a hopeless atmosphere. She held his hands, repeated the words he wanted to hear, and essentially ruled the country through his illnesses. By that time, legends spread among the people. Some called the king a martyr who atoned for Spain's sins with his suffering. Others said he was cursed and that his madness caused the nation's misfortunes, defeats in wars, loss of influence, and economic decline. By the 1740s, Spain lived automatically. Bureaucrats, ministers, and the king's wife kept the state moving, while the monarch himself stayed hidden. His figure had almost no political power left, but at the same time it remained a symbol that could not be removed. Everything moved toward the inevitable end. In 1746, Philip's body could no longer cope. He was exhausted, weakened by decades of sleepless nights, hysterics, and manic fits. In the early months of that year, Philip's health suddenly declined. His body, drained by years of constant crises, no longer obeyed him. He barely rose from bed, refused food, and mumbled incoherent prayers. Servants said that he could repeat the name of Marie Louisa for hours, as if waiting for her to return. Elizabeth Farnese stayed close. She was wife, nurse, and at the same time the messenger between the king and the outside world. No one saw him directly. Ministers spoke only through her. All official papers and royal documents passed through her hands completely, and nothing reached the king without her direct awareness. The entire royal court existed in a constant state of waiting for the inevitable end, though no one could know how long this suffering would continue. During the spring and summer months, the king's condition became critically unstable. He barely recognized the people standing near him, lost his ability to speak, and thrashed about restlessly in his sleep. It was as if his mind itself was trying to escape from an invisible prison. The guards heard his cries echoing through the dark halls at night. He called for his deceased wife again and again, repeating her name until his voice was hoarse and broken. On July 9, 1746, around 4 o'clock in the early morning, King Philip V of Spain finally died. It happened quietly, without any festivities, processions, or public ceremonies. His last minutes were far from royal splendor. Wet, tangled sheets, convulsive movements of his fingers, and the faint sound of his first wife's name leaving his lips. For Spain, his death became not only the end of an age but also a moment of heavy relief. The court, the citizens, and even foreign diplomats saw his passing as the long-expected conclusion of a 40-year rule during which the country had been governed not by reform or reason, but by the obsessions and inner demons of a single man. History preserved him as a king, but behind the royal title lay an image that terrified even his own entourage. He entered the chronicles not as a builder of the realm, but as an example of how human weakness and dependence could ruin an entire kingdom. By the 1740s, the image of Philip V had completely changed in the eyes of his contemporaries. For his ministers, he was no longer a monarch but an obstacle that had to be carefully avoided. Every real decision was made by Queen Elizabeth Farnese, who strengthened the positions of her children and created foreign alliances. The Spanish court lived by an unspoken rule, to address the queen instead of the king. French and Austrian ambassadors described Spain in their reports as a nation without a sovereign. They noted that Spain was losing its political weight, that power dissolved behind closed doors in secret talks, and that the monarch had become a symbol of illness and dread. Across Europe, rumors spread quietly. The throne in Madrid was occupied not by a ruler, but by a ghost. Inside Spain, new stories and gossip grew. People spoke of a king afraid of mirrors, hiding from sunlight, and spending his sleepless nights in screams and prayers. Some interpreted it as holiness and divine sacrifice. Others called it a curse upon the dynasty. Meanwhile, Spain itself was weakening. The economy was fragile, its influence in Europe was fading, and wars were waged without a monarch's leadership. The court lived in constant anxiety. On the one hand, nobody dared to declare openly that Philip was incapable of ruling. On the other, everyone understood that only a hollow image of royal power remained. All of this made the atmosphere in Madrid gloomy and uncertain. The palace resembled a sealed, dark chamber, and the nation lived as if waiting for the end that would finally free it from the nightmare. On July 9, 1746, Spain awoke in complete silence. Philip V died in his royal residence, spending his last hours in delirium and confusion, repeating the name of Maria Luisa. His death was not accompanied by pompous ceremonies or mourning processions. For both the court and the people, it was above all a liberation. The country, which had lived 40 years under the shadow of his obsession and madness, could at last breathe freely again. In the capitals of Europe, the news was received calmly and without emotion. No one expected reforms or victories from Philip anymore. For a long time, he had been regarded as a man detached from reality and deprived of real authority. To diplomats, he remained a weak emblem of the dynasty's decline. To historians, an unsolved mystery. A monarch whose name appeared in the lists of Spain's rulers, yet whose life resembled that of a recluse living in isolation. His reign became a unique example of how endless fear and trauma could determine the destiny of a whole nation. Instead of politics, dependence. Instead of reforms, prayers and hysterics. Instead of royal control, a closed room and curtains that hid screams. The memory of Philip V in Spain remains full of contradictions. Official chronicles emphasize his role in preserving the Bourbon line and the dynastic marriages that strengthened bonds with Europe. Yet behind these lines there is always another story of a country ruled by a man consumed by his own demons. Historians call him not a builder or a reformer, but a possessed king. His legacy is not cities or triumphs, but whispers, letters, diaries, and notes of courtiers and servants who were too afraid to look beyond the royal bedroom. Thus ended one of the strangest and most haunting chapters in the history of Spain, the rule of a monarch who governed millions but could not govern himself.